Okay, our next speaker is Michelle Hanlon. Michelle is the co-founder and president at For All Moonkind, and she's also the co-director of the Air and Space Law program at the University of Mississippi School of Law and its Center for Air and Space Law. For All Moonkind has been recognized by the United Nations as a permanent observer to the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. Michelle also chairs the International Committee of the National Space Society and is the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Space Law, the world's oldest law journal dedicated to the legal problems arising out of human activities in outer space. Michelle, welcome to the Lunar Development Conference.
Thanks. Thank you so much. It's great to be here, and I am thrilled to talk about heritage and preservation and the Artemis Accords and lunar governance and anything else that comes up. We have, it looks like a pretty small group, so I can't see a chat function when I am sharing my screen, but I'll go through the presentation pretty quickly and then we can discuss, because I'm looking forward to hearing everybody's views. So I'll just start by saying it is the 51st anniversary, and it's an honor to be here talking about the moon and thinking about the moon when we know, 51 years ago today, we put a human on the moon. It's a pretty incredible legacy for the United States and for humanity. I want to start by discussing why we need the Artemis Accords. And if you don't know what they are principles prepared by the State Department and NASA to guide bilateral agreements to discuss how to explore the moon and utilize resources on the moon. It's important to note that they're just guidelines and principles. We don't know what the actual bilateral agreements are going to look like. They're still being negotiated. But the United States put together these accords to highlight the things they expect from their collaborators as Jim Bridenstine likes to say, go forward to the moon with international partners. And the concept of why we need these bilateral accords is because, as I'm sure many of you know, international law has a lot of gaps in it with respect to outer space, most primarily with respect to property rights in space and heritage in space. So just as a primer, international space law is generally made up of 4 treaties: the Outer Space Treaty, the Liability Convention, the Registration Convention, and the Rescue and Return Agreement. All of them are silent with respect to the preservation and protection of human cultural heritage in space. All of them are silent with respect to the utilization of resources in situ or otherwise, but they do affirm the concept that a nation may not claim sovereignty over territory in space, and they require that nations authorize and supervise their entities. And so that's how the international law reaches private entities and private companies, because the nations in which they are constituted, those nations are required to authorize and supervise their activities. There's also a 5th agreement, the Moon Agreement, which has only been ratified by 18 nations. And the United States last April basically refuted that agreement and said it basically indicated it had no intention of signing the agreement, and it did not agree with some of the principles, primarily that space is a global commons. Back to the Outer Space Treaty, what does it say about what we're going to do on the moon and what can we do on the moon? Well, Article 8 says that the state party on whose registry an object launched into outer space is carried shall retain jurisdiction and control over that object. So we know if we launch something into space, if we launch something to the moon, we always retain control of that object, whether you're the United States, whether you're the Russia, China. If you are a US national, then it will be considered an object owned or within the jurisdiction of the nation from whom you launched it from. So that's pretty strong. We know we have property rights in the stuff we put up there. Article 7 says that other people will be liable for damage to a space object. So if somebody harms something that I've put into space, that other entity is going to be liable for damage. And this is great for operational equipment. It gives you a recourse against other people. I won't get into how that recourse might be found, because that's going to, we've not had any litigation with respect to space objects at this point. But if we're talking about heritage, what is considered damage if the space object is non-operational? I don't know, nobody knows, but right now it seems to me, if someone were to damage the LEM, the Eagle, because there's nothing to damage because it doesn't work, there would be no liability because that is just considered a US object. It's not considered an artifact or something special. The other problem is if you switch this around and it says you can't touch anything regardless, does that mean objects can't be moved? So of course, we would argue you don't want to move the Eagle, but what if there's another object that is taking up space on the moon where you want to go? It's not an artifact, it's inoperable. Does liability mean I can't move that? And then all of a sudden it feels like somebody has claimed some sort of territorial ownership over whatever that object may be on. And so this liability for damage, this concept is very hard it just leaves a lot of gaps. It's not completely clear. Article 9 of the Outer Space Treaty has something called the due regard provision. So every activity in space must be conducted with due regard to the corresponding interests of all the other parties. Now, what does that mean? You know, to normal people, civilians, non-lawyers, it means respect and courtesy, thoughtfulness, right? Well, for lawyers, it means something else. It's only been litigated once, and that's with respect to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. And the tribunal declined to find a formulation for any universal rules. So there's no definite rule. Instead, they set up this balance, the rights that they extend, the nature of the rights held by the second state, their importance, the extent of the anticipated impairment, the nature, blah, blah, blah. Lots of lawyer speak, nothing definitive there. That is not the kind of language you want protecting our heritage in space or operational equipment that you have spent millions getting into space and on the moon. Article 9 also has a requirement that you have an international consultation if you think you're going to cause harmful interference. Now this is important, okay? It says you must have an international consultation. It doesn't say you can't harmfully interfere with something else. So that's again, it's not a strict binding thought or force. And the other issue with harmful interference is, again, what does harmful interference mean? And what does it mean on the moon? This picture is of the Surveyor 3. It was 300 feet from Apollo 12 when it landed. And the regolith that shot, the plume of regolith that came off the LEM and hit the Surveyor actually pitted and scratched the Surveyor. So again, Surveyor was an inoperable object, but what if it had been operable? That regolith would have rendered it inoperable. Is that harmful interference? And how do we judge harmful interference? It's going to have to be, we know that from the studies on the plume effect that that plume goes everywhere. And so we have to figure out an accepted level of risk. How much do you have to protect against and how much can you be protected by law? So another gap in the international law. And finally, there's a distinction between the sites and the artifacts or the operable equipment themselves. Now, this is primarily talking about artifacts and cultural heritage sites, but we know that you own the objects that you send to the moon. We know that you can make somebody else liable if they damage those objects, but what's not protected by anything are the actual boot prints, the rover tracks. Those right now can be run over, scuffed, beaten up, whatever, for impunity. I mean, we always think, For All Moonkind, we think, wow, what if somebody actually just, you know, took a plaster cast of the boot print and then brought the regolith back on Earth and sold it, saying this was, you know, this was the original boot print. These are real things that can happen and not be a violation of international law. And so this is what I ask you, is this harmful interference? This is, do we want to see this happen to the very first boot print? So now I get back and we start talking about, you know, what is cultural heritage and why is it important for lunar governance? There's two reasons. One is because it is a path to lunar governance. Preservation is something we can all get behind. And the other reason is because it assures our universality. It reminds us that we are one species and it will help us be more collaborative in space. So to get people in the right mindset, I take us back and think about human milestones. So the archaeologists sketch human evolutions as key psychological events. We discovered how to harness fire. We overcame our fear of open water. We learned how to draw and communicate complex thoughts. These were all milestones, critical milestones in our development. Reaching the moon is one of these critical stages, and one that could not have happened without centuries of human history and innovation. Centuries of evolution got humanity to the moon. It started with things like the Ishango bone from the Congo, which is from 18,000 BC. This is the fibula of a baboon with a sharp piece of quartz affixed to one end that may have been used for engraving. Originally, we believed it to just be a tally stick, but it has 3 deliberate columns running its length, which are now thought to indicate understanding the various mathematical relationships. So our first calculator. In the middle, you see glass. It's generally believed that glass making was discovered 4,000 years ago in Mesopotamia. Glass is not only used in arts, but also lens and optics. It's crucial for observational astronomy. So we marvel over these items and we protect them. The eagle, Apollo's lem, deserves that same reverence. It is these centuries of human evolution that got us to the moon. We wouldn't have that lem without that baboon's bone. So you see, human history on the moon really begins about 3.5 million years ago. These footsteps in Liability, Tanzania are considered the first evidence of humans walking upright. And what does that mean? So that's pretty cool that we're able to find these footsteps from 3.5 million years ago. But what it really means is being up on 2 feet freed us up to be able to use our hands. And what did that do? That let us innovate and make glass and learn about math and talk to each other and carry things. And that is the kind of evolution we needed. Without standing upright, we never would have gotten to the moon. And so the point is not, we go back in history, the point is to remind everybody that everything is built. I always end with this concept of the being on the shoulders of giants. We are on the shoulders of all of our ancestors. We could not have gotten to the moon without each of these evolutionary revolutions, if you will. We understand this on Earth. This, in 1969, Egypt wanted to build a dam to develop its economy. The Aswan High Dam did flood this valley with Nubian temples, Nubia being considered one of the cradles of human civilization. Egypt understood that this was not a good thing, but development and preservation go hand in hand, right? And so they reached out to the international community and said, we really need to build this dam for our people, but we really don't want to ruin these temples. And the international community didn't say, oh, that's an Egypt problem. The international community said, wow, yes, this is the cradle of human civilization. We need to do something. So the international community came together and raised $40 million and moved these in the 1960s, piece by piece, out of the path of the dam's flooding. So this was the birth of the UNESCO World Heritage Convention. 193 nations came together ultimately and agreed that world heritage is something that should be preserved by all humanity. So what are we talking about when we talk about artifacts on the moon? We found 110 sites on the moon with stuff on them. I'll go through Apollo. Obviously, it's Apollo's anniversary today, and they're the most remarkable feats, the human travel to the moon. Apollo 11 left behind an olive branch. They left behind messages of peace from more than 70 nations. They left behind a patch to Apollo, the astronauts of Apollo 1. They also left commemorative medals for the Russian cosmonauts who lost their lives in the human quest to reach space. So it's not just space and it's not just exploration and science. We humans understood what a big deal this was when we went to the moon. And these are just some of the things that commemorated that. The other Apollo missions also had all their own firsts. Apollo 12, like I said, Charles Conrad brought back a piece of Surveyor. The first time we sent something to the moon and brought it back with us. This rumor has it there's an art on the moon. This wafer, ceramic wafer with art, including from Andy Warhol, was supposedly stuck onto the leg of the lem. The rumor has it there's been a whole PBS special about whether it's really there or not. And so as they would say on Mythbusters, the myth is neither confirmed nor denied, but it could be there as well. Apollo 14, Alan Shepard became the first person to shank a golf ball on the moon. That golf ball is an artifact at this point, right? Apollo 15 was the first time humans drove on the moon. And this is also when we had the feather and hammer experiment. The feather and the hammer are still on the moon. Apollo 16, Charlie Duke left a picture of his family. So what more human can you get than to bring your family with you in terms of a picture to the moon? These are humans who went to the moon, not scientists and explorers and pilots. Apollo 16 also, also left the fallen astronaut memorial. Again, memorializing all the people, all the humans, not just the Americans, who sacrificed their lives in our quest to reach the stars. And finally, Apollo 17 was the final mission of the Enterprise, and it had the first scientist, Harrison Smith, and it was the last time humans traveled beyond Earth orbit. So all in, we count at For All Moonkind more than 110 sites with human material on them. And so that includes Chang'e 3, Chang'e 4, which is still going right now on the far side of the moon, Bereshit, Chandrayaan, and including Eugene Shoemaker's ashes, which were sent to the moon. And these are probably, we assume, the first human remains to be placed on another celestial body. So clearly, the moon holds a bounty of cultural heritage on numerous sites, instruments, personal items, and yes, human waste and other debris that can reveal the truths and facts of each moon landing and tell the unique story of human vision and creativity. The sites and the artifacts are an archaeologist's dream. They confirm humans as an exploratory migratory animal. They are frozen in time, undisturbed by wind or rain, and untouched by any other human or any living organism since. This photo was taken from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. You can see the astronauts' footpaths. This is how pristine these sites are. These sites memorialize the work of thousands of dedicated individuals like NASA engineer Ron Crill, pictured here. So 400,000 people on Earth helped to, in the United States, helped to put Neil and Buzz on the moon. But they also memorialize the hundreds of thousands, if not millions, who came before them who dreamed of the stars, Galileo and his counterparts, mathematicians, astronomers from all over the world who dreamed of reaching the moon, who studied the stars. That's what these sites memorialize. So preservation is a compelling idea that can help unite people rather than divide them. It's an idea that can help build a sense of community among people throughout the world. That is why preservation is important. But it's more than that. I want to take you back again and think about the last time humans looked out over a horizon, not knowing what was on the other end, and built ships to get wherever. The Polynesians, they sailed into the horizon, not knowing what they would find, not knowing if there would be land on the other end. And what did they take with them? They brought their community, they brought their culture with them, they preserved their heritage. You go through the South Seas and Hawaii, and they all have saved the sense of themselves. That's what we save when we preserve our culture and our artifacts. But it's not even just that. They, from island to island, saved the knowledge of how to grow food. This is another thing you save when you preserve heritage. You save knowledge, you save experience. And that is especially true with Polynesians. When the Western Europeans arrived in the Polynesian islands, they didn't believe that this culture could have sailed from island to island before the Europeans themselves did. And so rather than learn from the experience of the Polynesians, they ignored it. They refused to consider that somebody else could sail. So how much have we lost? How much did the Western Europeans lose by not paying attention to this history and this experience? And so when we talk about lunar governance, when we talk about a human community on the moon, we need to create that community. We cannot live unsustained and unnurtured by our history. And saving our culture on the moon is one way to do that. So think about UNESCO. We want to talk about how cultural heritage will influence lunar governance. Well, we can't apply the World Heritage Convention, but the World Heritage Convention demonstrates a strong custom on Earth to protect heritage. So we can't use UNESCO, the World Heritage Convention, because the World Heritage Convention states that Any site that you want to preserve, you can only nominate a site that's within your territory. Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty says no nation can claim any territory in space, and therefore nobody can claim or nobody can nominate any site in space to be heritage. But the UNESCO World Heritage Convention, again, signed by 193 nations, seeks to protect sites of cultural significance that are so exceptional as to transcend boundaries and to be of common importance for present and future generations of all humanity. Regardless of sovereignty, the convention emphasizes the importance for all the peoples of the world of safeguarding unique and irreplaceable property to whatever people it may belong. This sounds to me like everything on the moon fits right into this description. And so the World Heritage Convention has created, or because we have signed, all nations have signed it, there is definitely a customary thought that artifacts, that cultural history, that artifacts of cultural significance, sites of cultural significance ought to be preserved. And Russian law also has a very interesting provision in its law on space activities, Article 17.5. It says, in the immediate vicinity of a space object of the Russian Federation, within the bounds of a zone minimally necessary for the guarantee of security or safety of space activity, rules may be established which are obligatory for Russian and foreign organizations and citizens. What does that mean? That means Russia has already contemplated the concept of a safety zone, much like we are talking about in the Artemis Accords. It's nationally, internationally recognized that things can be dangerous and we need to actually explore what due regard means. And Russia has now stated that they are going to think about due regard, and they're going to think about actually barring not just their own citizens, but foreign organizations and citizens from getting too close to their artifacts, like Luna 2, the first human-made object to reach the moon in 1959. I just put these up also for history. Luna 9 and Lunar 1, actually the very first wheels on the moon. Of course, Lunar 2 has been sold to Richard Garriott, although it can still be considered an artifact. But the point is that the Russians, who also have a lot of stuff on the moon, have recognized the need to protect. They don't call it heritage, but they are definitely identifying this need for a safety zone. So add to that the fact that NASA has created recommendations and guidelines to actually preserve historic sites. Now these recommendations and guidelines suggest a safety zone. They are differing perimeters depending on which Apollo it is. Apollo 11 and 17 are of the greatest concern for protection. I don't know off the top of my head, but I think it was land at least 2 kilometers away, approach no closer than 600 yards or a kilometer. So again, safety zones. All of a sudden we're seeing UNESCO has a customary, we have this custom of preserving heritage. Russia understands we need to protect things in space with some kind of a safety zone. NASA has recommendations. Now these are not law, these are just recommendation and guidelines. They're not binding on anybody, least of all other nations. They're not even binding on the United States. One thing that For All Moonkind has done is worked with Senator Peters and Senator Cruz on the One Small Step to Protect Human Heritage and Space Act. This act would make those NASA guidelines binding on US entities. Now, keep in mind, those guidelines only cover certain American sites, and they're not, the actual prohibitions are ones that should be updated constantly, and that's something we put into the bill as well. But if we make them binding on US nationals, we again build this custom to recognize that we need safety zones, this custom to recognize that we need to protect our heritage, and this custom to recognize we need to better define due regard and harmful interference. This bill passed the Congress a year ago today, passed the Senate a year ago today unanimously. Unfortunately, it is now languishing in the House. So if you get any support for All Moonkind, and you can shoot an email to your congressperson, we need to get HR 3766 to pass, hopefully in this Congress. I know they're a little busy, but it would be really great and a huge step for both heritage protection and building this concept for safety zones in space for operational spacecraft as well. So that brings us back to Artemis. Artemis the Artemis Accords have 10 or 12 principles. They mirror the outer space treaties. They talk about peaceful use. They talk about transparency. They talk about rescue and rescuing and due regard. And they talk about heritage. This is the first time heritage has been elevated to the level of all these other principles under international law in space. It's the first time any nation has actively promoted the concept of protecting heritage in space. And I would say probably because it supports this concept of deconfliction of activities, of creating safety zones. We can agree that preservation needs to be protected. And if we can come to agreement on how to protect them with what kind of safety zones, then we can move that agreement to cover non-heritage items. You know, talk about things like operational vehicles and safety zones for mining activities, for exploratory activities, for astronomical activities. So the point of my presentation is to say, we all agree on preservation here on Earth. And so why don't we take that agreement and use the tools we need to protect certain heritage? And again, and we're not saying everything that's on the moon right now needs to be protected. We are saying development and preservation goes hand in hand, and we need to manage preservation and development, and we can do so with the use of safety zones. So what can you do? So vocally recognize the need to protect human heritage in space. What we want to do is build a customary international law. We want to build custom to protect heritage and protect operational. So we start with protecting heritage because that's what everyone can agree on. So we are, For All Moonkind, we're a bunch of lawyers. We're talking about how do we create custom. And today, in these days, it used to be only nation states acting could create customary international law. But it's become recognized today because of technology and because of how much that a lot of what only states used to be able to do, private entities can do now. So private entities can actually be involved in the formation of customary international law. So the more people, the more entities we see saying we need to protect these sites in space, the growing strength we'll have to argue customary international law. Build international consensus for safety zones by using them first for heritage protection. So let's get out there and talk about protecting heritage and creating safety zones around around heritage sites. And then it's just going to be natural to say, well, if we did that for Apollo, doesn't it make sense to do that for my experiment on this in the South Pole, or for my testing on these in situ resources over here? The point is, people are afraid of safety zones, but we need to address it because it's really hard. We don't want to suffer from zone overreach, right? We don't want another entity or another country saying, oh, we need 20 kilometers around our site or else you're gonna damage our equipment. Let's get on the page and let's talk about how much we actually need to protect our heritage, and then that will become the model for operational. So we want to make preservation in this way, make preservation and safety zones customary, because if we build them for preservation, then they will become much more comfortable. People will become much more comfortable with the concept for operational. Again, call your congressperson, pass HR 3766, and of course I have to put in the plug for All Moonkind. So look at these two footprints. Laitoli, Tanzania, human beings stood up and freed their hands to be able to carry things, to be able to build tools. That footprint is protected. That footprint is preserved. They actually cover it up each year. They cover it up using the same materials that they originally found it under, because that material protected it for 3.5 million years. And they only open it up to view every 3 to 4 years. So lovingly cared for. The boot print, not so much. People argue, well, you know, it's up there, it's preserved, nobody's going back. But we all know, everybody in this conference certainly know, that we are going back, and we're going back in droves. And these sites of cultural historic significance are going to be tourist sites, or worse, could be vandalized and have materials brought back to Earth and sold. So I like to end with the Bernard de Chartres, we are like dwarves sitting on the shoulders of giants. We see more and things that are more distant than they did. not because our site is superior or because we are taller than they, but because they raise us up and by their great stature add to ours. So I think these giants, they deserve their blueprints protected. Thank you. That was the end of my presentation. I was happy to take questions or discuss.
Hi, Michelle. This is Michael Mealing. Had a quick question I put into the chat, but I figured I'd unmute myself and ask it here. Yesterday we had, and I'm blanking on his name, talking about the application of NEPA to space in general, and some of the discussions led to at least some idea from a few of us working on some legislation that at least puts a moratorium on applying NEPA in its full and glorious length of time it takes to get an EIS. Your particular bills, they sort of stand alone and are dependent on any existing environmental legislation. So if there was such a moratorium, your legislation would still stand alone, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. We were talking to a couple other people earlier today, and the idea of having to wait 3 to 5 years for an EIS to wind its way through the federal government before you could go to the moon made level 3 planetary protection rules from NASA seem friendly in comparison. So I will ask another question if that's okay. Your definition of heritage sites, how does that match the definitions that were in NASA's designation of level 2 for the Apollo sites?
So we have not actually designated any historic sites. We want to start the process going to figure out how to designate historic sites. Certainly, I would say, you know, the NASA's historic sites are just American sites. I'm not, from a personal standpoint or from a For All Moonkind standpoint, you know, I think we would fall on a sword for Apollo 11. But there's, you know, there are a lot of really good reasons to tamper with the sites for scientific purposes, you know, for engineering purposes. And so this is something that we need to protect the sites, not necessarily against all behaviors, but we need to protect them so that the right people are getting to them first at the very, very least. So again, For All Moonkind is not advocating, you know, any particular site needs to be preserved. Well, aside from Apollo 11, I don't think anybody would argue with that on my board. But we believe that there are, of those 110 sites on the moon, some do need protection, and we believe that the right people should get together and figure out what that protection means. And so that's why we like to talk in terms of managing the protection of heritage in space.
Thank you.
So I see a question from Sajal Sharma talking about the overreach in safety zones. So yeah, the biggest concern when we started looking into the research about how to protect is that we can't just say, for due regard, for liability, we cannot simply say, if you land something on the moon, nobody else can touch it. Because then you can have a country or an entity burst a bomb over a moon and sprinkle nails for 10 square kilometers. And then say, oh, don't touch that nail, you'd be liable. And the other thing we're very concerned about is China. China's activities in the South China Seas are suggesting that they are trying to harness their heritage, their underwater heritage, to make territorial claims in the South China Seas. This is absolutely what we are against. And so we really need to understand, and we need to get international agreement on what it means to protect. And if you talk to Phil Metzger, who's doing sort of work collaborating with, he does a lot of research into the plume effect. You know, the plume effect covers the entire lunar globe. When something lands, that regolith goes around forever. You can't protect against every risk. And we don't want to do that. But we have to determine a level of acceptable risk and how much you have to engineer your spacecraft to meet that acceptable risk. One thing that I really like are the concept of common lunar landing pads. We get the landing pads, we don't have to worry about the plume effect. Also, it's a way for us to create international collaboration. You know, we have airports on Earth that everybody uses. Why can't we have the same for the moon? So I see also from Art Harmon the same kind of question. Hi Art.
Hey, how are you? I'm utterly pleased by your project, and it echoes many of the same things that I've been working on. So my hat's off to you.
Thank you, and I appreciate the concern. I think we all think China could claim the entire South Pole as theirs. Right now, they could probably claim the entire far side as theirs right now, because you know that their equipment is there and we can't land very close to it. You know, well, due regard, you're going to harmfully interfere with us. This is something we have to address right now, and I know there's been concern about the Artemis Accords. That a lot of organizations say that it's a bad idea to do something bilaterally. But the fact of the matter is that the international community is dragging its feet on this. And it's not to say the international community is doing a bad job. The Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space does a great job, but nobody wants to talk about this. And so essentially by creating these Artemis Accords, the United States has forced everybody's hand. We've now started talking about it. And sure, Russia says they're gonna go partner with China. You know, I don't know, but I have faith in our State Department and our NASA diplomats to at least get some concept of these bilateral accords. And remember, the International Space Station is governed by bilateral agreements. You know, that's not, it feels multilateral, but it's not. Those are all one-on-one agreements between states. And so I see the Artemis Accords as taking that working model and using it, trying to pull what they can out of it to cover governance on the moon.
It really is the beginning, the foundation of the rule of law in space.
Exactly. And I know, you know, people sort of roll their eyes when I start talking about fire and footprints in Tanzania. But again, you know, we have agreed on Earth that this stuff needs to be protected. And why, I have not met one single person who has said, oh, I don't think we should protect Tranquility Base. You know, yes, of course there'll be arguments about what needs to be protected, what doesn't. But I think we can start with a baseline, and from that grow into protection of both heritage and operational spacecraft.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Well, I will let everybody go and attend the other functions. So thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. And I will see you in one of the other rooms. Nice to meet you, Art. Thank you.
Pleasure. Yeah, we'll stay in touch.
All right, definitely. And thank you too, Mike. Take care.